A lot of people dealing with Israel, especially things going on currently, libertarians definitely have a really hard time following how Israel fits into the world order, how it has, and how it will. So, what I'm going to do is talk about where Israel has fit in terms of neoliberal order in the past, and then get into a bit of where I think it is going should Trump get to implement foreign policy as he and his advisors see fit. Here's the bad news for you: Palestine probably isn't part of this new world order that's coming along. Now, I believe we are most likely in the process of transitioning from the old neoliberal global order to a newer order that's more respectful of nation states, most notably the United States. Now, if you have questions on the neoliberal order, you can check out my other videos that get into it in a lot of them, or you can ask questions below. If it's a new idea, I might just run with a video off of it as well. Now, Israel was almost always, at all times, the red-headed stepchild of the global order. Israel pretty much has to be, because of their current situation and their situation in the past, they're a very nationalistic state. So, as a nationalistic state, the neoliberal order isn't fond of it. And for most of Israel's history, they have made policy difficult in the Middle East. Essentially, whenever we want to do something with Arab states, we have to kind of tiptoe around Israel to make things work. In many ways, they are akin to being the last functional colony in the world. Now, people make a big deal about Truman, and he briefly embraced Israel as a means to win the 1948 election. And at best, this was a campaign tactic. It did not reflect the true feelings of the establishment at that time. Eisenhower openly opposed Israel's military adventures during the Suez Canal crisis. He was hoping to build an Arab NATO. His goal was to prevent Soviet expansion in the Middle East. It didn't happen. And part of it came down to is the Arab states saw Israel as a greater threat than the Soviet Union, and the fact that we weren't willing to allow Israel to be completely sacrificed meant they were never really going to come into our camp fully. Now, during the 60s and 70s, Israel was given grudging and a mostly subdued form of aid, with the exception of when Israel was actually in danger in 1973, Yom Kippur War. Nixon basically made it clear that we would continue shipping arms in there to prop them up. Now, essentially, during the 60s and 70s, what the United States had in mind for the Middle East was that Turkey and Iran would act as the physical barriers to the Red Army entering the Middle East. And since the Arab states were not responsive to the idea of creating a military alliance that would be helpful to us, Israel ended up acting as the local uh, agent to prevent covert communist takeovers of the Arab countries. The Middle East was a very delicately balanced region. The oil producing states had an understanding that if they became too radical, the West would intervene one way or the other, either by overthrowing their government or actually invading, which happened during the 50s, 60s, 70s. The West had to pretend not to favor Israel. The Arab states had to balance the propaganda advantages of supporting Palestinian causes versus the instability of going too far in that support. In other words, Israel was a great boogeyman to the Arab governments, and they would use the Palestinian cause to rally their populations to various things they wanted to do. But there was a dangerous downside, especially if you had a lot of Palestinian refugees. Good example being Jordan, where the Palestinian refugees almost overthrew the government. Now, Israel always looked to its own needs first. It's what a nation state tends to do. and they demanded the action, or excuse me, the freedom to act on their own security concerns. And because of this nationalism and this Israel first attitude, they were pretty much hated by the neoliberal order. But as long as they were useful. Now, after the Shah of Iran was overthrown, Reagan elevated Israel to peer status with NATO. Although we didn't have a direct treaty saying an attack on one is an attack on the other, pretty much Israel was almost at the same level, essentially being we would promise to go to their aid for virtually anything. Um, so then, when the Soviet Union fell 10 years later, it caused Israel's place in the global order to reset. Israel, as a nationalist state, was not welcome in the neoliberal order. With a lack of a Soviet Union, it stopped being useful. From the perspective of the neoliberal order, they have always felt that Iran needs to be pulled back into the fold. That's why we see many, many diplomatic events that have occurred since 1980 to current, most of them ending up humiliating the United States because we essentially go way out on a limb to show that we really want to be bestest friends with Iran, and they usually publicly out us doing it and make us look like fools. The reason why this keeps happening is because the neoliberal order is adamant that Iran is essentially the communist China of the Middle East. If communist China could be made a global power, well, certainly so could Iran. And also, for the neoliberal order, Israel is looked at as an unfortunate nationalist mistake. They believe it never should have happened in the first place. It's old colonial empire games that predate their system. So the goal for the neoliberal order, as far as Israel was concerned, was to create a two-state system. Now, mind you, the two-state system of some sort was envisioned from uh, during even the Palestinian Mandate and earlier, but the neoliberal order had a different idea for why they needed Israel to exist as a two-state system. A two-state system ends up sidelining Israel from the affairs of the Middle East because they're going to be too bound up dealing with security problems of their own. The idea is to turn it into a system that is dysfunctional and a multi ethnic state, much like Lebanon, with nobody actually having power and just a constant state of unrest. Now, the first Gulf War, followed by the lack of a Soviet Union, ended up unleashing US policy in the most frightening way because many US policymakers now believed the United States was a super duper power. And I am quoting. Uh, and so they began pushing for the two-state solution in earnest for the reasons I talked earlier. Essentially, they saw Israel's power projection as a hindrance, and by implementing a two-state solution, Israel would be too busy with internal affairs to be a problem for the Middle East anymore. Now, during the 90s, following the Gulf War, the US attempted to engage in Iran in hopes that at some point Iran would become the China of the Middle East, a globalist linchpin for the region. And Iran repeatedly refused to take the bait. Meanwhile, during the same time period, the neoliberal order worked diligently to create the two-state solution in Israel. It was also during this time that the neocon movement was on the rise. Neocons sought to find a reason to reinvade Iraq with the goal of remaining, or basically taking it and turning it into a multi-ethnic democracy. The neoliberals looked at neocons and thought they were pretty much going to fail, but they were in the driver's seat, so they were allowed to do their thing because if they somehow succeeded, it would help the neoliberal order. If the neocons succeeded or failed, it didn't matter because the result would be the destruction of an Arab nationalist state, which is fine with the neoliberal order. Nationalist states are not welcome. So, in the wreckage of post invasion Iraq, the US redoubled its efforts to bring Iran into the global order and push the two-state solution on Israel and Palestine. Also, in the wake of Gulf War II, the color revolution idea was greenlit. The goal was to get locals to replicate the Iraq effect in every country. Basically, either make the country so unwieldy and splitting the ethnic divides to where the countries were essentially non functional, denationalize these states. Either the country would become a global partner or their nationalist state would be shattered into warring tribes. Both outcomes are fully acceptable to the neoliberal order. Iran would experience the 2009 Green protests, and this is often noted as kind of the beginning of the color revolutions of the Middle East. However, unlike the Arab ones to come, this one actually seemed to be organic and not coming out of NGOs that were planted in the countries. Iran blamed outside forces, but this seemed very poorly organized in comparison to the Arab counterparts. Between 2008 to 2016, we see three parallel diplomatic efforts in play in the Middle East. We see the continued pushes for the two-state solution for Israel. We see the color revolutions break out in Arab states, including direct NATO involvement. Ideas being to convert or destroy Arab nationalist states. The continuing effort to integrate Iran back into the global fold. Was also an item that continued, with minor diplomatic efforts going on all the time and failing. So, what is Trump's foreign policy? I don't really have a good name for it, and if someone comes up with it, put it in the comment section. For the moment, I call it neoliberal light. So it has similarities to the old neoliberal order, but it's a lot less intense version that doesn't require as much from the United States. Essentially, it involved a shift from the US being the guarantor of world security to a pullback where the US creates regional blocs to stabilize areas. Neoliberal anti-nationalist policy blinded them from the possibility that Arab states had matured in their views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is something the Trump team recognized and was ready to work off of. So, in general, the first thing that happened with the Trump administration was they immediately recognized the Golan Heights as being annexed by Israel and that Jerusalem was the capital. Now, the neoliberal order had insisted for decades that to do this would basically upturn the region. There would be massive wars breaking out. Everyone would attack Israel. It would shatter the peace. And nothing happened. And so this really appeared to be an attempt to test the waters to see what would happen. Reactions from the Arab states were very muted because the groundwork had already been laid. The second step of the Trump administration was to isolate Iran economically. They boosted sanctions. They laid into our allies to stop trading with them. They basically caused Iran to have to minimize the amount of messing around they do in the Middle East. The third step was to normalize diplomatic and trade relations with Israel and Arab countries. Implicit in this was future mutual military treaties, and this was ultimately known as the Abraham Accords. The fourth step was essentially Palestinian autonomy within the Israeli state. So a weak Iran and the world not caring about their protests on the Golan Heights and Jerusalem was meant to demoralize the Palestinians. By demoralizing, they would be less likely to demand the things they had in the past. Arab states joining with Israel, signing agreements with no Palestinian preconditions was meant to further demoralize the Palestinians. The Trump plan was effectively a buyout plan, and it would have turned the Palestinian areas of Israel into a modern, thriving economic state. They would have ended up, the Palestinians, occupying more land than they do now. Now, the general plan, and the plan's out online, I think I've done at least one video on the plan itself, uh, was very ambitious. It would increase the amount of Palestinian land, but it would essentially end all claims other people have on each other's land. It would set in stone the boundaries of things. It would expand Palestinian areas into the Negev Desert. That's where they get the extra land from. They would build a tunnel connecting Gaza to the West Bank areas. And in general, they would be setting up to create a massive flow of money to rebuild Palestinian port facilities, build up their roads and infrastructure, build industry, and then essentially one of the most ambitious water projects ever to bring agriculture to the Negev Desert, uh, basically giving the Palestinians uh, a very robust economy. And the idea was if they were so busy becoming affluent, they would stop being violent. The major stipulation was this wasn't a true two-state solution. The Palestinians were very specifically semi-autonomous regions of Israel at this point. And the Palestinians ended up rejecting this, one, because they weren't willing to accept the idea of uh, semi-autonomous, and they were complaining that even though they were getting more land out of the deal, it was less land than they had before the 67 war. Now, once the Trump administration's out of office, we have the Biden administration come back and essentially try to reset everything back to the way the neoliberal order was doing things. They tried wooing Iran back by lifting sanctions, unfreezing frozen assets, and renewing the nuclear deal. So, one last stab at getting Iran back into the neoliberal order. The two state solution was put back on the table as the only answer to the Israeli conflict. Biden heavily downplayed the impacts of the Abraham Accords. Yet, at the same time, they diplomatically isolated Saudi Arabia over some issues with a reporter being assassinated by Saudi security forces. This caused Saudi Arabia to essentially continue moving forward with the Abraham Accords, regardless of the United States even working with it anymore. So the Saudis were moving forward towards a military alliance with Israel. Now, Iran and Hamas ended up surprising Biden with the October 7th attack out of Gaza, as well as the Iranian response with missiles. The sole purpose of these attacks was to disrupt Saudi Arabia and Israel from moving forward with their mutual military treaties. So Biden moved forward with a very awkward red light, green light approach to Israel's dealing with their Gaza problem. Israel seemed to have been greenlit to level Gaza, while all the time Washington, D.C. seemed to be trying to micromanage it. Neoliberal types began publishing papers within the days of October 7th, touting a two-state solution with permanent UN aid agencies and peacekeepers in Gaza. In other words, a new money laundering operation, probably akin to the way Haiti has been set up. Now that Trump is back in the driver's seat, and he will probably be trying to head in the same direction of neoliberal light. The idea is, how do we get a military bloc forming up between Israel and other Arab states that is a credible counterweight to future Iranian issues? So expect Trump to go back to isolating Iran. They're probably going to try to re-push their buyout plan with the Palestinians, with the current state of Gaza, uh, and damage to Hamas leadership. It's possible the Palestinians might be more warm to this idea. I don't know. There's also a chance Trump might be open to the idea of allowing new settlements and essentially Palestinian relocation programs. However, the one thing that's a guarantee is the Abraham Accords will go forward. Whatever creates the most stable form of Israel that can partner with the Arab world is what's going to appear as the table of solutions. Uh, a robust, equal Palestine existing as a true separate state side by side with Israel is not beneficial to the stability of Israel, and I don't see it going forward as being something that's going to be pushed or it being attempted to be enacted. And just to make clear, I mean, I don't necessarily see this as the best way to make things work out. But to a certain extent, if the goal is to create a stable military alliance, it's the only direction things can go. If there's a silver lining, the silver lining is less U.S. military in the area to offset the regional problems, with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other Arab partner states taking the lead. So that would be one plus that comes out of it, is that a lot of our troops would end up coming home. All right, in the comment section below, what do you think? Do you think Palestine as a two-state solution has a future, or do you agree with what I'm saying? Do you have a different take on what was going on during the Trump administration in terms of Middle East policies? Because I'll be honest, this whole neoliberal light concept is still a little bit murky. I don't even know if they have a full idea where they're going with it yet either. So if you have a different take on it, I'd like to hear it. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, check out my other titles. You'll find things you'll like. Subscribe. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.